lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths. This guided Bob and Millie Peckham. They were my parents, and on the 28th of December, it would have been my mom's 97th birthday. But she died the year 2014, actually on Peruvian Independence Day. That's very significant in multiple ways, and I'll get to that. She died on the 28th of July of 2014. El 28 de julio, día que cantamos Somos libres, seamos los libres. We are free now, and we will always be free. That was the triumphant Peruvian national anthem that we sang as my mom died. But let me tell you about this triumphant life. Mom was born Mildred Olive Reisner in Brazil, São Paulo, Brazil. Her parents were Presbyterian missionaries. They were agriculturalists. Grandpa was one of the first graduates of Davis, and he went to Davis and Berkeley. And he was on a farm in Winters, California, and he rode on an Indian, one of the first motorcycles. He was always ahead of his time. He would ride his motorcycle to canvas and all kinds of crazy things. In fact, I could have been the third generation of Cal Berkeley. I chose not to. I chose to reinvest in this very classroom. I taught junior hires while I went by bicycle 10 miles each way to Cal State Fullerton. I could have gone right here. This is where I taught my 7th graders, including Steve Geis, who was a missionary.
Well, welcome home.
Yeah. There were actually partitions over there, and I was usually in that one, in that corner. But this is where Woody Amirian would teach us verses. So, legacy of, I'll just focus on a legacy of Mildred Olive Reisner. Olive was her middle name because her mom, who was Dorothy French, her mom had a very special friend in med school, well, actually nursing school in the San Francisco area. My grandma was born 1900, and she was 6 years old when their house in Oakland shook and the bricks came down and hit her brother, Bam, and he cursed, and his father excused him for cursing since that was the only time he was allowed to curse, because this brick came down and hit Bam. He later was in World War I, and he had shrapnel all through him, and all the rest of his life he would get these little bumps on him, and he would rub on them, and out would pop a piece of metal from World War I. That was my great uncle Bam. And anyway, this family from Oakland and Winters, California got together, and they went to Brazil. And my mom was born 3 years after they got to Brazil, and she grew up loving the Lord and loving the Brazilian people, speaking Portuguese, studying French, studying Spanish, learning English. But she realized someday she's going to be in a country that she doesn't really know, that her parents are from. And at that time, it was 7-year terms, not 4-year terms. It was a long time between your ships to and from Brazil. They'd go on a freighter. But Mom just wanted to know about everything, especially that she would need to know in her future. And her sister had a friend, a close friend, another missionary kid, and some Brazilian friends, but Mom was kind of alone a lot. So she sat in a chinaberry tree and read books. She read anything she could get her hands on that would help her know, what's this America place like, and how do people live there? But she graduated from high school at age 16. So she was so wise, she realized, most of the kids in America are not yet graduating from high school, so why don't I take another year? I'll see what a high school in the U.S. is like. After McKinsey Academy in Sao Paulo, she wanted to see what this culture is like. And so she arranged to live with an uncle. Her dad's little sister was married to a very influential doctor in Sacramento, Dr. Huntley, and she lived there with them, worked as a secretary. She could type 70 words a minute with no mistake in any language. And she just gradually eased into American culture, and then when she was going to go to college, she heard there was a Christian Endeavor camp at Zephyr Cove on Lake Tahoe. So she went to Lake Tahoe, and she was not completely outgoing. She wasn't really outgoing, but she was determined to know the people of this country that her parents called home. And there was this handsome young man lying on a towel listening to his radio, and she liked the music. I'll have to say that my Dr. Huntley, my uncle that she lived with, he raised musicians. He had twins that were viola and cello, and his house was full of music, and out of that house came some of the Christian, or some of the Christmas music, like Silver Bells, and some of that came out from his household. So Mom was interested in music. She sees this guy listening to a radio laying on the pebbly beach there, and gets acquainted and finds out he built his own radio. And he just grew up on a little street called Peckham Street in Fullerton. And here she knew the world. She'd been to 7 Latin American countries, and she had been to 41 of the states. And here all he knew was Peckham Street in Fullerton, which is still there. It was a little dirt lane when my grandparents lived there. And my dad was born premature, double hernia. The family was very poor. They were poor because of a teacher's strike that affected my grandpa in San Diego. There was a very popular teacher in San Diego who other teachers envied very, very much for his popularity. And it was like the Daniel situation where those guys envied Daniel and his power. Well, this happened in San Diego too, around the time of the Prohibition. In 1918 and 19, this popular teacher, someone brought up a charge against him, said he thought he had seen him go to this restaurant that could secretly sell alcohol. And so the school board fired the guy, and that led to such an uproar that they didn't go to school for a whole year. That meant my grandpa couldn't graduate from high school. He could never find a good, real high-paying job. He just played the piano for a singer on the radio, and he worked in a mine. And later worked with wrought iron, and he was a tournament longbow archer, a great craftsman. But he just didn't get the opportunity to go to school. So they were a poor family. They couldn't afford the double hernia operation for my dad. So my dad couldn't play sports, and Dad could ride a bike. So he rode his bike all around Fullerton and delivered papers. And they were very frugal. This is during the Depression. He saved up all his money when he was 18, graduated from high school, bought his hernia operation, and went up in an airplane for the first time, because a lot of his paper delivering would be around the Fullerton airport. And you always see these airplanes coming and going. And during World War II, they had placed an anti-aircraft gun on Peckham Street in case the Japanese came flying over. And so he was aware of the war, he was aware of, and so he joined the Navy Air Corps, and he was training to take off of aircraft carriers, and a guy in the navigators shared with him a real personal relationship with Jesus Christ. He had grown up in the Church of Christ on Anchorage and Yeah, Wilshire and Harbor in downtown Fullerton. His mom was the organist there for 40 or 45 years. But he didn't really know a personal relationship with Christ until he was there. But now by the time he met Mom, he really knew the Lord. He was fascinated by the breadth of her knowledge. Mom could talk knowledgeably about anything in the world. And he said, well, if we ever get together, if we have kids, our first priority is going to be travel, because it's really done you well. So they traveled a lot. We traveled as a family, and Mom had a hidden prayer request that she would someday be able to influence other missionary kids. Well, Dad got a teaching job at Santa Ana High School, and he taught Kathy McCall math, and some other people you might know. But Dad realized that was kind of a dead-end street. He always wanted to be a teacher of missionary kids, and they had missed the opportunity, but he heard the Garden Grove School District would offer a sabbatical year. So he shifted school districts, got a sabbatical year. We went down, when I was 14, I turned 15 in a landslide in the Andes Mountains, stuck for 3 days in landslides. And my parents then knew what it was like together to live in another country. We traveled all the countries, most of the countries of South America, and I said to the Lord, give me Spanish, and I'll give it back to you somehow. Well, I came back, and I was 16 years old, and they started doing short-term mission trips from Calvary Church here to Mexico. And over in the building across from, well, it was the women's lounge for a while. It had many purposes since we built it when I was in high school. But over there, the room packed with high schoolers that wanted to go on a mission trip. And the leader of the Youth Unlimited Gospel Outreach looked at the group and he said, oh, wow, I'm glad to see such interest, but I can't take this many. We don't have enough interpreters. And then kind of as an afterthought, he said, well, unless there's someone here who speaks Spanish. Well, I was 4'10" and a half and 92 pounds, and I was always really small. And I sat next to Lori Stuke and Mark Hoover. They were on either side of me. They were 6'2". They grabbed my arms and shot them up in the air, and I was very quiet. The guy called me up to the front, and he started preaching in Spanish. Well, I interpreted it into English. Then he switched to English, and I put it into Spanish. He said, wow, I can take another 10 of you. We've got an interpreter.
Oh, cool.
And he said, maybe there's another here? And this tall, beautiful blonde stood up, and she spoke perfect Spanish. Her parents were Bible translators for the Ojilan Chinanteco down in Mexico, Becky Smith. So we became good friends through Wycliffe parties and working together as interpreters the next 5 or 6 years. And she was on and off dating Dennis Swick. And my mom told Becky at one time, I don't know what's going to happen with you and Lloyd and Dennis, but you're always my girl. And the way that took place is, when we came back from Peru, and now as an interpreter on weekends and such trips, our house started filling up with missionary kids. These kids would graduate from down in Peru or Mexico, and if they're going to Azusa or Biola or Westmont, let's stay at the Peckhams. In fact, our house was so full of missionary kids. One night, my parents were coming back from a Christmas party, and they tried the front door. They couldn't get in. Dad was pushing on the door, and he couldn't. Yeah, I'll stick with it. Right. He was pushing on the door, and he couldn't quite get it open. And he thought he saw a sleeping bag. And so they went around to the back door, found the hidden key, and opened the back door. And they found It was wall-to-wall missionary kids. All these sleeping bags because these missionary kids had been praying for snow in the mountains and got so much snow they couldn't go on the retreat. And then a missionary that we had been with in Peru, she opened her house in Pacific Palisades. So early that morning, all us kids went up to Pacific Palisades. Now I'll tell you one thing, not all missionary kids appreciate being a missionary kid. There was a guy named Mark Eichenberger, whose dad was a real brilliant doctor. Dr. Eichenberger started a system of health promoters that permeated South America, wherever Wycliffe was in South America. Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia. Dr. Eichenberger set up medics in each village that could handle the minor cases so that doctors could handle the major ones. But Dr. Eichenberger's son, Mark, began to hate Christianity, hate Christians, because of the neglect of his dad. And while we were on this retreat up in Pacific Palisades, Mark Eichenberger dropped in. Even though he hated Christianity and such, but one missionary, an adventurous soul that rode his bicycle across the Andes 3 times and built a boat and sailed it down the Amazon River and through the Caribbean twice, and Mark went with him once. Mark came over to see me at this retreat, and he invited me and Becky to go to this training ship for the merchant marines called the Golden Bear. He was going to become a sea captain. And even though he usually kind of disassociated with other MKs, he took us to the ship. And I thought, this is a rare opportunity, so I brought a Bible to give him. And usually when I give away a Bible, I make kind of a treasure hunt. I didn't get to do much in that one. I underline verses and let them find them. That was in 71. You know, on the weather reports lately, they've been saying, oh, we haven't had snow like this, rain like this since 71. Well, that was 71. And Mark Eichenberger went on to become a sea captain. He went on to break some world records rowing a boat from Punta Arenas, Chile, 500 miles through the icebergs to Antarctica. It's written up in National Geographic. But Mark Eichenberger's dad was still a doctor when I got very sick in Indonesia. And so we came back. They didn't know what all diseases I had. But Dr. Eichenberger and his wife were treating me, and they thanked me. They said, Mark had hidden away in his chest that Bible you gave him. And he's come to know the Lord.
Amen.
The last 2 years of his life, he knew Jesus and loved Jesus. And then a storm like no other hit the town of Punta Arenas, Chile. He was first mate on the supply ship that would take the scientific expeditions, all their supplies down in Antarctica. A huge wave. I don't know if you've ever been in this situation, but I and my dad have, where you're on a boat at anchor and you're in a storm and all the boats have to turn on their motors just to keep from banging into each other. And he was in that situation, and he was arranging something in the front of the boat, and a giant wave washed him off, never seen again. And his parents had to go down to Punta Arenas, Chile, while they were treating me, and they found his Bible in his sea chest. Mom and Dad trusted in the Lord with all their heart. They didn't lean on their own understanding when it didn't work out to go to Peru right away or go other places. But they had the gift of hospitality, like it tells us to do in Hebrews 13:1. And by that hospitality, we will never be able to measure. But let me tell you a couple things that happened. One is, Mom had told Becky, I don't know what's going to happen with you and Dennis and Lloyd, but you'll always be my girl. Well, Becky married my friend Paul Nystrom, my bug collecting buddy. Paul and Becky are in this missionary prayer book, and you will find them, Paul and Becky Nystrom. We were very close friends. We learned how to love without possessing and how to build each other up in the Lord. And Paul's mom got cancer. My dad got cancer. The two families were in the same Sunday school class here, and they'd take turns taking meals to each other's house. And Aunt Betty died, and my dad died, so Uncle Doyle married my mom. And so for 18 years, Mom was no longer Mildred Olive Reesner. She was Mildred Olive Reesner Peckham Nystrom. And God has blessed those grandkids. She dreaded the idea of being a step-grandmother or a stepmom. But boy, her generosity, her hospitality to all those kids, she was the only grandma most of those Nystrom kids know. And grandmothering went to a different level. And this mission prayer book, Mom's the one who started these. The assignment of Sunday school classes to missionaries, Mom did that. The library, Mom did that. The evangelism, Dad did that. We went to jails. In the afternoon, he'd ask this table full of missionary kids at our house, and he said, who's going with me to Singing Springs? Who's going with me to Joplin Boys Ranch? Who's going with me to the rescue mission? And some of us would jump up and go join them. So this church was built with volunteers. May it continue.